Hello, this is Caitlin O'Brien, and I am the discussion leader for this week's materials for Millions Like Us, directed by Sidney Gillet in 1943, and then Mollie Panter-Downes' letters. So let's get started with Millions Like Us. This is the basic content overview. It's very, I don't want to say vague, but it's just very the basic gist of everything. So the film follows the journey of a young woman named Celia as she is called to serve on the home front. This is something that she has actually been looking for. She was, at first trying to go for those more glamorous positions, but she actually ended up working in a factory that produces parts for airplanes, and that's where she meets Fred Blake. The two fall in love, and they are eventually married. Spoiler alert, Fred does die toward the end. And there are a couple other characters in the film that I'm not going to be looking closely at. I'm going to mention a couple of them. This includes Jennifer Knowles, Charlie, who is the factory kind of like manager, Jim, this is Phyllis's and Celia's dad, and then Gwen, who is Celia's roommate. I'm also going to briefly mention Mrs. Blythe. She has a pretty decent presence in the first part of the film. So the overall tone of the film is light. There's this positive attitude toward participating in the support services on the home front and even serving in the war as well, which is different than what we've seen in World War I think especially from the female perspective, and I'm thinking mainly about Vera in Testament of Youth, and then kind of like this resentment that I can't think of their names, but the main character in 1917 has. There's very little resentment even in moments of loss or frustration, and there's this great sense of patriotism and contribution to the government. So as I briefly mentioned, the tone of this film kind of contrasted with the World War I film Testament of Youth on some level, where Vera felt that it was her duty to kind of step back from Oxford and go participate in the frontline nursing efforts. But through her experiences and involvement, she kind of grew this resentment and moved towards pacifism, and kind of like, why is war the answer here? Some notable scenes that I came across, there are three big ones. I'm going to mention the first two, go a little bit more in depth when we talk about the London War Notes. But the conversation between Jim and Phyllis, Jim and Celia, and then also the interaction that he has with Mrs. Blythe, it starts with Phyllis kind of saying, I've signed up to work on the home front, and Jim is kind of like questioning her of like, you don't do anything. Why are you doing this all of a sudden? And she explains herself, and he just kind of is like, whatever. Like it shocks him, but I don't think he takes a huge issue with it. And then it goes over to, he starts talking to Mrs. Blythe, and Mrs. Blythe, as I understood, was kind of like a support staff for I think for Jim's family, and she says that she, is trying to get her old job back. She needs to fill some financial gaps and responsibility with her husband. And then at the same time, Celia is like, and she tells him, hey, Celia also got called to the home front. The government wants her to report soon. And Jim has this moment where he's kind of frustrated and worried, and that kind of carries over into the overall tone of the scene. But it's quickly met and overshadowed by his great sense of patriotism and pride. He says something along the lines of, like, nobody will tell me that I'm not a patriot. I'm letting this happen. And I think that's kind of like the overall tone of the movie. Like, it's kind of like light, and this is kind of like, this is the way things are. Later on in the film, there's this moment where the factory workers have to take shelter. It's just kind of like, this is like an ordinary event. This is run of the mill, this always happens type deal. And then they're just ready to go straight back to work. something that really, really stuck with me was when Celia returns to work, or she shows up at a banquet hall with Gwen at the 1.5 hour mark, and there's a singer on stage, and she starts singing about, "I should be now a proud and happy bride." And as she sings that line, you hear planes above, and the scene shifts over to looking at the planes, and it shifts back to Celia, who's looking up, and she has this like very mournful look, and there's like this moment where the viewer feels this. And it kind of becomes the tone of the scene. But quickly, Gwen starts singing along, and all of a sudden, she's like looking at Celia, trying to get Celia into the mood, and Celia starts singing along when they start singing like "Waiting at the Church," waiting at the church. And it shifts, that sad tone shifts into a happier, more prideful tone where the viewer isn't left mourning Fred. They're left, I think they're still sympathizing with Celia, but I think that they're left with kind of like this weight lifted off their shoulders of like, she's okay. She sees that this was kind of part of the fallout of trying to get through this war. And I think that Celia starts to take pride in being married to a soldier who sacrificed his life. With that, we're going to transfer into Mollie Panter-Downes' letters. So basic content overview. The letters just discuss the start of World War II and kind of what's happening throughout the war. It gives you the initial reactions of British people. It gives some insight as to like how children are perceiving what's happening. And I brought this up because a child says, "It's all right, Mommy, I know what it is. It's a gas mask, and we put it on when they bomb us." And this is found on page 9. For this section, I talk about the page numbers of the actual pages, not the PDF document. So keep that in mind if you're following along. But this moment really stuck out to me because I think it just reminds us of, I think it brings us back down. I think when we talk about war, especially because there hasn't been a war on U.S. soil in so long, assuming that's where everybody is right now, it always seems so removed from us. We've never truly experienced war. And so I bring this up because it really reminds me of this current moment with COVID where kids know what's going on, where parents and adults are kind of facing like this anxiety of like, what do I say to my kid about this? And this moment where the child says that to their mom, I just brought it up because I just thought it was an interesting way to connect it to our current moment. Lastly, on this page, we have documents with memorable dates of the impacts of war and kind of what's happening on war. On page 41, she talks about the first date is like where food rations start with bacon and butter. And then she also talks about other things that happened throughout that year. Everything from conferences to people like I think she talks about like the U.S. and I think Great Britain declaring war on Japan and so on. And I brought this up because from a teacher's perspective, if I were to be teaching history in World War II, I would definitely pull out these letters because I think, again, when we learn about war, there's so many things happening in such a short amount of time where we kind of like lose dates. And I think that these pages do a great job in grounding us in what's actually happening during that time. The tone that I picked up throughout her letters, there was like this matter-of-fact tone of like, this is what's happening, very like journalistic. And then it's also complemented by like this sarcastic tone where I think especially in the beginning letters, I think she's trying to come to grips with what's happening, why are we going to war type thing. And I kind of struggle picking up on sarcasm and satire. So for example, like Prater Violet, it was kind of, a lot of it was lost on me. But yeah, having the sarcastic tone in some spots, I think it was very strategic in how she approached it. Some final thoughts. I see some of the things that Mollie is describing in her letters. I see that reflected in Millions Like Us. I primarily focused on her first entry and her last entry. So on her first entry, September 3, She says, the English were a peace-loving nation up to 2 days ago, but now it's pretty wide felt that the sooner we really get down to the job, the better. This really brought me back to the conversations with Jim and Phyllis, Jim and Celia, Jim and Mrs. Blythe, and then the factory workers during one of the attacks, where it's just kind of like, yes, there's this frustration. Why do we have to go to war with the conversations? And then it moves into like this, well, yes, this like needs to happen. So we got to get to the job. And then same with the promptness of getting back to work after they took shelter. And then lastly, we have the final entry on May 12th. This is where she's describing women wearing bright colors. People are cheering because it's the end of the war. And this reminded me of the final scene of that I described earlier with Celia in the banquet hall listening to the singer, where she's trying to grapple with her husband's death, and having these constant reminders around her. But even in the face of that loss, everybody kind of came together, and it was only centered on Celia because of the direction and where the camera was, but coming together, singing, trying to lift up spirits in the face of loss and grieving and trauma. And then in Downes' entry, people coming together, even though people are grieving and dealing with loss and trauma and stuff, they're coming together to celebrate the end of something. That's all I have here. I have a couple questions to consider. One is, in what ways, if any, does the tone of Millions Like Us compare with previous films and novels that we have read this semester? 2, how might the tone differ if it took place in the wake of World War I as opposed to World War II? 3, how do the supporting characters and subplots in Millions Like Us contribute to the tone of the piece? 4, how do the tones represented in the letters and film contribute to your understanding and background knowledge of World War II in any context? That's all I have for you. Best of luck. I can't wait to see your great ideas. And if anybody had read different tones in the letters, I am so excited to read about those. So